Brian, Bloomberg Opinion, senior executive editor and an MSNBC political analyst, and Jason Stanley, professor of philosophy at the University of Toronto and the author of Erasing History: How Fascists Rewrite the Past to Control the Future. Gentlemen, welcome back to the weekend. Tim, the president's calling himself the chief law enforcement officer of the United States. The president is not the chief law enforcement officer of the United States. That is the attorney general. But this is the second time, at least, he has said that in public, and yet no one sees fit to jump out there and say, you're wrong.
Well, I mean, I think that's the issue, right? As long as he says, I'm the chief law enforcement official of the United States, and then acts on it, and the institutions don't push back, whether it's the legal system, the courts, the GOP, or anyone else who understands that that amounts to authoritarian government and not democracy, we're in trouble. And he's also being outrageously and obviously selective about it when he's pardoning George Santos, who had demonstrable crimes around wire fraud, identity theft, grifting off his own campaign donors, the January 6th protesters. I imagine he's teeing that up to pardoning Ghislaine Maxwell at some point.
Just thinking about her.
Peter Navarro, Steve Bannon, other people involved in the J6 insurrection. You could go down a whole list of people who Trump has just decided aren't criminals by fiat and not through a legal system or a court process. And on the other side of it, the cases against Comey and Tish James in particular are spurious. The fact pattern is not substantial enough for either of those two people to be in a courtroom. You could go back to Bolton. That prosecution began with the Biden administration, right. And I think the fact pattern's more complex there.
Right, that's a more complicated.
Yeah. I think there's a wait and see on that one. But given the fact that this administration has already weaponized the Justice Department and torn at the sort of fabric of public trust that the law is administered in a nonpartisan way, across a boundary of facts that make sense, as opposed to being political hits, you lose faith in these institutions, which is the goal.
Right.
Jason, also part of the goal of authoritarians and authoritarianism, and you told me this is your expertise, is the dehumanization of your opponent, right? And what we've seen from Republicans, we've been showing it all morning, is them calling Democrats evil, saying that they hate America. Talking about the rallies as anti-American rallies, the ones that we saw yesterday. Talk about how that is key to trying to change the fabric of a nation and make people believe something that isn't true, and therefore makes it much easier. So if I dehumanize Mr. O'Brien here, and then I beat him up, everybody's going to be like, well, he was raggedy anyway. He should have been. Like that. Like, am I simplifying this too much?
No, you're exactly right. I mean, I would take issue with one comment, which is that I think at this point, they're not trying to convince anyone. Yeah. They're just saying, those are our political opponents, we're going to destroy you. So they've moved to talking about Democrats like you would talk about an external enemy, like you would be in a war with an external enemy. And I don't think they're trying as much to say, oh, we're going to convince people these are evil terrorists. They're just looking for any reason whatsoever to bring the law to bear against the political opposition. And look, this was always going to happen. It was always going to happen that they were going to move from non-citizens, from immigrants to the political opposition. History tells us that the political opposition is always, authoritarians always need to jail, to prosecute, to make people afraid of becoming Democrats. Really, in this next phase, you have to move to targeting ordinary Americans with fear. And I think they're moving beyond the I'm going to try to convince you phase and moving into the we're going to make you afraid to be members of the Democratic Party.
And then what? What happens after authoritarians do that? What happens after the deputy chief of staff at the White House says that the Democratic Party is a domestic terrorist extremist party? What happens after that?
Well, this is where it gets tricky for them, actually. as Tim was saying, the institutions now have to stand up. They're, I think, a little bit over their skis. They're thinking, all of this is very explicit now, right? So we have to pay attention to the expressive function of what's going on. It's not just about the prosecutions, it's about saying we can do whatever we want. And that's what they're trying to say. They said, we're going to target you as a terrorist if you call us fascists, which is a very fascist thing to do. So
You're about to get a call.
So they're trying to move that way. And the response by our politicians, by Gavin Newsom and others, is just to say, okay, now we're going to call you fascists. So that's the right response, to say we're actually going to resist this attempt to make you afraid.
Is that the right response, though? I feel like in the last election there was a lot of hand-wringing about the use of these terms, fascism, authoritarianism, and that it kind of went over voters' heads. Are there more effective rhetorical techniques to communicating?
Well, then there wasn't any evidence, right? Like there was nothing to point to.
I mean,
it was all theoretical.
Folks get it now.
No, but it was more theoretical,
right?
But I mean, the insurrection.
Yeah.
I mean, people, when in these authoritarian moments, retreat from politics and they focus on their ordinary lives. And that's what authoritarians want you to do. They want you to turn off the politics and just be like, OK, I can still go out to dinner. I can still go to the club in Bushwick. So
Viewers don't get that joke.
Jason was out.
So I agree with you. I think a lot of people did not expect what we're seeing now, and a lot of people are going to choose authoritarianism. They're just going to retreat from the political realm. They're not going to notice that of the freedoms that they lost.
I mean, that's the danger, right? Is it because the other response to this is silence and submission.
Yeah.
And so in an environment like this, where it takes a lot of courage to stand up when you see institutions crushing other people.
But so we're having this conversation the day after we just saw.
Yes.
Exactly.
According to the organizers, about 7 million people from coast to coast taking to the streets. It's not. I think they may have, the words authoritarianism and autocracy might have flown over people's heads during the campaign, but they certainly understand what it means now. So, what should in an authoritarian regime see 7 million people come out onto the streets? What's their reaction the day after or the days after? Does the Trump administration just keep doing what it's doing? Or as Paola Ramos said in the 7 o'clock hour, she's looking to see whether ICE's reaction in the aftermath is amped up in reaction. What do you think?
Well, I think they will amp it up. And I think that's, in advance of the No Kings protests, they were calling it anti-American. They were slagging it. When public protest is the most basic and real demonstration of individual democracy you can have other than the vote. It's a very American thing, and there's a long tradition of it and a constructive tradition of it. You only have to think about the civil rights movement, for example, to see where you get
the Boston Tea Party.
The Boston Tea, the Revolutionary War.
Come on now.
It was a war. There have been a couple wars. I do think they're going to ramp it up after this, and I think it would be, I think the Democrats are so bad at messaging, tactical messaging. They constantly get lapped by the Republicans on a daily basis around this. But I think you're seeing in the government shutdown, latching on to healthcare, latching on to meat and potatoes issues that you can wed to legislation, that you can wed to messaging. And there's other issues like this, housing affordability, access to high quality jobs, et cetera, that you could build successive protests around. This one was just about authoritarianism, but I think there's other topics that could be usefully built upon.
What do you think, Jason?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the MAGA is throwing cultural red meat to Americans in order to hide the fact that they're stealing our health care, that they're passing incredibly regressive legislation to hand money to the billionaire class, to their crypto friends. So this is the classic method of throwing sand in people's faces. And I think Tim is exactly right that focusing on affordability issues, when they call Mamdani a communist and he says, well, yeah, I want, free health care, I want free buses, Americans are going to be, and he is appealing across party lines. So I agree with you that moving to this, talking about fascism is well, it's ever less abstract. It's ever more concrete to people right now, as you were saying. But the affordability stuff, just making clear that they are trying to steal our basic economic necessities in order to enrich crypto bros and tech billionaires while throwing, hippie at people is not going to work.
Tim, before we run out of time, you are someone who has a big following and has been pretty outspoken. You have not been one of the silent self-censorers. Have you heard from Trump at all? Is there anything that's given you pause about what you say publicly?
No, I mean, he used to come after me on social media. That stopped. I imagine, I don't know what I am and is that anymore. But I think, I'm fortunate in that I've had institutional backing. I've been at big publications like the New York Times and Bloomberg, where there's a tradition of looking after reporters and protecting what they do. When he sued me for my book, my publisher hired an incredible attorney, and we stripped the bark off Trump in a courtroom bit by bit. But that's not because I'm a hero or anything. It's just I had institutional support. But I do think people need to remember that Donald Trump is a bully, and that values are eternal, and that people have to stand, especially in this moment, have to stand by what they believe in because we're part of a community, and that we have to reestablish those communal bounds so everyone can focus on what matters and not get distracted by this chaos agent.
One of the things that I think was really interesting about 2024 and when Harris took over, because she has always talked about it as freedom versus democracy. One of the reasons, because everyone kind of thinks of democracy in a different way. Like black voters hear the word democracy and they think one thing, but you hear freedom, everybody agrees that you should be free. Tim O'Brien, Jason Stanley, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
On the weekend.